do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes. Of course one enjoys the feeling of power. The newspaper can create great controversies, stir up arguments within the community, discussion, can throw light on injustices, just as it can do the opposite. It can hide things and be a great power for evil. It's not a perfect system, obviously, but can you think of a better one?
Hello and welcome to episode 14 of Murdochracy, the podcast that keeps an eye on the news and influence of Newscorp, the most influential media company in the Western world. I'm Cam Wilson.
And I'm Sami Shah.
Hey, Sami, I've been thinking this week, I've been meaning to ask you, how is your campaign for Warringah going?
It's kind of crowded. It looks like everyone else is campaigning for Warringah as well. I think there's more candidates for Warringah right now than there are people in Warringah, which is making it a little bit challenging. But, I have high hopes for... I heard Gladys dropped out. And I'm assuming that's largely because she saw the strength of my following and just knew, I'm the better candidate.
And you two were both in the same kind of campaign, traditional, like conservative figures, big hitters. You really were vying
with a really controversial dating history. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And whispers of corruption, but hey, it's neither here nor there.
Yeah. Oh no, in my case, they're not whispers; they're hollers. Yes.
You two were both vying for the same vote, so I think that certainly clears a pathway for you to get the nom.
Well, I mean, look, I'm not saying that this is just my first stepping stone on the way to the eventual prime ministership, but that's only because I don't want to jinx it by saying it. So I'm not going to say it. It's for others to say, really, is the way I feel. Yes. The question is, if you were in Warringah and it was me versus Gladys, who would you vote for, Cam?
Sami, of course. I work with you. I know you so well. Of course I vote for Gladys.
That would be a reason not to vote for me. Yeah, exactly.
Sami, you would have my vote every time. Do you have any like big policies, anything big changes you want to see in Warringah specifically?
I mean, I've never been to Warringah, so visiting it would be nice, I think. I know that in Labour doesn't consider that a major criteria for pre-selection either, so I don't know what the big deal is with that. I'm really easygoing. I think the only thing that really bothers me these days is the fact that I've discovered that all hipster cafes don't serve cold water, and ethnic cafes do, and I want to fix that divide. Why is there this cold water divide between the two cultures? But other than that, I've got no other policy platforms, really.
Oh, and if there's something like electorates like Warringah love, it's a little bit of diversity, not so much that it's a big change, but a little bit. That's fine. They like that.
Yeah. I wouldn't mind being token.
Hey, Sami, we are chatting to Dr. Denis Muller, who is a senior research fellow at the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne today about the results of the Senate inquiry into media diversity. It had a big finding that gave a bit of a push towards a Murdoch Royal Commission. Do we have some Rob Menton? We will be discussing that with him, along with, how this kind of stacks up against quite a lot of proposals for media reform in the past couple of years. But before we get on to the good stuff, the meat, I just want to thank as well. We had Nathan is a new patron for us who's contributed. So thank you so much, Nathan, for helping out.
Welcome on board, Nathan.
It does mean a lot. Yeah, we really appreciate it. And if you do want to contribute to the running costs of this show and all that, our Patreon is at patreon.com/Murdochracy, MURDOCRACY. For our first story of Newscorp News of the Week, the big story this week to me was about the cozy relationship between politicians and Newscorp publications and how they can sometimes go wrong. I think it was last week that we discussed that politicians sometimes give exclusives to publications like Newscorp. That's nothing new. But what is interesting and why I bring it up today is about how these, this information, these drops, these leaks, whatever you want to call them, are told to the public, how they're sold. In particular, I've noticed that Newscorp publications, their kind of in-house style guide, I think leaves a lot to be desired about how they tell their audience how they came about this information. And this can have problems, as was revealed this week. So there were two big stories. The first was a story about how China allegedly hacked Queensland power stations, which were, according to the author James Morrow, the Daily Telegraph's political editor, who we cited last time as kind of being in the position of getting a very convenient, kind of pro-Dutton drops in the past. He wrote that they were minutes away from shutting down. And there was even a front cover on the Daily Telegraph, which had this big picture of Xi Jinping like kind of looming over a power station, looking kind of ominous.
It is some quality Adobe Photoshop, by the way. Like, it
Oh,
is
absolutely.
really worth looking at. Yes.
It was great. Yeah, kudos to the graphic designers. The only problem about this was that a Russian organized crime group had actually already claimed responsibility for the attack a week before. The company CS Energy also pointed out that it was false to say that it was a state group or that they were minutes away from shutting down. So really, the main crux of this article actually kind of turned out to be false. And in the way that the article is written, it's kind of sold as, high-ranking intelligence officials told us, and doesn't really give much information about where it came from, which puts them in a bit of an uncomfortable position when it turns out to be completely wrong. The second story, which was kind of similar, which is a really interesting opinion piece reported by a South Australian publication, In Daily's Tom Richardson. He wrote about how the South Australian government has been giving COVID health information not to all the publications, but to the Adelaide Advertiser's then Newscorp publication. He spoke about it a bit. He wrote about how this has, certain ramifications during a public health crisis, particularly because I think the Adelaide Advertiser as a Newscorp publication is usually the only one that has a paywall up on their COVID information, although they sometimes do take it down. But he also gave an information about how sometimes it goes wrong. He said last Friday, the Advertiser said that the state's Crisis Directions Committee, which is kind of bureaucratic committee that's informing how the state is dealing with, COVID emergencies, would likely close the state borders for the next fortnight because of Omicron, which it had sourced before this meeting happened. But it said it was likely to happen. Except it didn't end up saying this. The Chief Health Officer, Professor Nicholas Spurrier, ruled it out the next day. So again, we had this, it was written as, it is expected that they will do this, and, the implication is that they had, some kind of information. That turned out to be wrong. And people, read this, think it is legitimate. They have no reason not to trust it, and it affects their lives. They start to worry about, well, will I be able to go and see my family over Christmas? And it ends up being not true. So I don't know, what do you think, Sammy? Do you think these articles are clear enough about how they're getting their information? Do you think it's normal that people change their mind, and so sometimes predictions like this that are reported will get it wrong? Or do you think that we need to, have a higher standard for how we, inform the public about, sourced information like this?
Well, it's been one of those big changes in news journalism overall, right? And this has been something that's kind of been a story since the 70s and 80s, moving into the 2000s. And in America, for example, one of the big shifts in journalism happened during the time of, I believe this was the O.J. Simpson trials and everything, where it stopped becoming a thing to have independent confirmation of a story before you run it. You can wait for someone else to do the independent confirmation, and then run the story as something that, for example, if you're CNN and New York Times confirmed the story, the CNN can say the New York Times has confirmed the story, and this is what the story is. You don't have to wait for CNN reporters to do independent confirmation. It was a huge shift and change in the way news was reported. If you ever saw that terrible TV show, The Newsroom.
Oh no, I haven't caught it. I've heard good things.
Wait, I'm thinking of I don't mean the Australian show. I mean the one that it was the HBO show that was directed. What's it called? The Newsroom? What was it?
Yeah, no, I think I was thinking of Frontline. Sorry.
Yes, no,
different altogether.
Yes, there was HBO series The Newsroom starring what's his face, Jeff Daniels. It was written by Aaron Sorkin. There's an episode where they're talking about that American senator who got shot by an attempted assassin, and many news channels reported her as dead. And in this fictional newsroom, Jeff Daniels refuses to report her as dead because he goes, no, we wait for independent confirmation. We're the only station that's going to do that. And it was this wishful thinking, clearly, on the part of Aaron Sorkin that news channels did this more. if, for example, the Daily Telegraph had said, you know what, this is a story that we've received some source information from within the federal government or within intelligence agencies that tell us this. However, we cannot confirm it independently. However, we're just telling you the story we've received. That's a way of framing it. But the way it is framed is this has happened, this is fact, it is indisputable. And then when it is brought into controversy or is questioned, there's no apology afterwards. And that's why there's this whole conversation around mistrust in the media. A really good example is Alexandra Smith. So Alexandra Smith is right now the state political editor at the Sydney Morning Herald, Walkley Award winner. And she was questioned about why the Sydney Morning Herald has so uncritically republished the information from Scott Morrison's office that Gladys Berejiklian will be running for Warringah, until finally it was kind of announced that she really wouldn't be. And when asked about this on Twitter, she said, "It was the PM pushing it, not us. We reported what he was saying." And many people have jumped on this as a very classic example of what's wrong with modern journalism. As opposed to just you're not PR, you're not the spokesperson. Your job is to question when someone says something. And obviously it's a small tweet. She's not betraying an entire style of journalism or anything by tweeting this out. And it's become a bigger Twitter storm than it needs to be. But it is telling that there is a cohort within Australian journalism that is too close to power, too unquestioning of power, and then too eager to retweet or republish claims made by people in power without the independent verification needed to tell whether or not it's the truth, versus just a narrative that is required by those people in power.
I think you're right. I also think that the fact that these thoughts of powerful people are reported is not inherently a bad thing. If anything, it's good to know what they're thinking, because that helps us understand how they're governing, how they're doing whatever.
Absolutely.
The point, though, is about contextualizing it. And so, if it is, saying that first one about the China hacking attempt, if it is something that has come from the office of Peter Dutton, saying sources with intimate knowledge of, Peter Dutton's thoughts or like something like that, giving people enough information so that they know where it's coming from, so that they can, I guess, critically analyze and be like, well, do I trust that person, their thoughts, rather than being like making it so generic that it kind of makes it, like hard to critique. Like I would want to know that Peter Dutton thinks this was China's like fault, because when it turns out that it isn't, I can be like, well, now I know that I don't trust that judge, and I think that kind of says, well, that you need to really wonder about that. But that is information, but it's about that context. And look, we've picked out Newscorp. That's the podcast that we're doing. Other places do it, but I do think it is something that I see from them a lot, which is they have, as the most powerful media company in Australia, they have these relationships, and they're kind of, I guess, like the way that the company deals with these relationships, just it seems like almost like the norm across the board is to, kind of err on less rather than more information about this, I guess, in a way to kind of protect that relationship. But the result is, I think it can sometimes lead readers worse off.
Well, it depends entirely again on the readers as well, right? So, will the readers who are reading the Daily Telegraph, for example, ever be given the information, unless the Daily Telegraph itself publishes it, that this was, incorrect and that a Russian organized crime group claimed responsibility? Or will they always just continue with the narrative that China did this and this is Xi Jinping's whole plan? And it depends entirely also on that, the audience, the way the audience is providing information to. And then if you were to go up to Daily Telegraph reader and say, actually, this is what happened, they would consider you as being full of misinformation because their source of information gave something different. And yeah, it's it's part of that polarization of news where you depending on your politics, you pick your news brand and you stick with them.
Next story is that Newscorp is announcing that they are hiring 30 new cadets. So hired from 400 applicants, which was actually, to my mind, actually not that many. The company announced that these cadets will rotate between newsrooms. It's good to see that they are hiring so many new positions. And if I don't know if people remember, but for a few years, such was the state of the Australian news industry that Newscorp, then Fairfax, now Nine, and other places kind of all shut down their cadet program. We've noticed that these have started up again with News Corp, which seems to be the biggest. Sammy, if it was your first day out of uni, you just studied journalism, you're done, would you, knowing everything about News Corp, apply for their program?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's so important to work in many and varied news stations and news channels. And it learn look, at the end of the day, News Corp has got resources. And if you want a good experience as a cadet with valuable resources, valuable access, on the ground training, things like that, I'm sure a place like Newscorp would be excellent for that. I'm a big believer in um work for whichever newsroom you can, especially in the early years, because the training you'll get and the way you learn to discern your own style of journalism or judgment comes from that kind of variety of experience. If you only work for the ABC, or you only work for Channel 10 or the Age or whoever, you'll only ever learn one style of working, and you'll also won't have access to many of the other resources other places have.
Yeah, I think that's right. I wonder what it's like, for instance, working for, back when Alan Jones was on Sky
Mhm.
News. If you'd want to be a producer for him, I think that's kind of being involved with that might make me feel a little bit worse. But
That, yes, but that's a different level. A cadet,
exactly.
cadet wouldn't be having that experience anyway,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Whereas these, like, there are many great, particularly the regional papers, but even, a lot across like the major metro ones, where you don't get sucked into the culture wars. You can kind
Hmm.
of just, have a great opportunity to do local journalism, which is such a great opportunity. So, if there are any budding journalists who are listening to this and do worry about the impact of some of the worst parts of News Corp, I think you can probably rest easy knowing that you probably won't be exposed to that.
Yes.
And look, if you want to, you can always, like, have a really you could be a whistleblower to us, or you can have a powerful walkout if you're like told to do something you don't want to do. But really, I think it's a pretty stock standard job a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's not to say that any other news place you'll work in, you will not have those arguments and those ethical
Oh
dilemmas as well.
yeah, yeah.
I've worked in many newsrooms in Pakistan and Australia, or at least worked with journalists in Australia, and those ethical questions and quandaries and everything comes up all the
Oh
time
yeah,
in
totally.
different stories that you wouldn't even think sometimes. So it's good to be outside your comfort zone and learn how you navigate that, and also how you'll feel about certain things and where you draw your own personal lines.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Apply away, I say.
Hmm.
For our next story, I wanted to update you on how a friend of the pod, Alan Jones, is going. After much speculation, he announced that he is signing with himself. The veteran shot jock says he's launching a digital media show, essentially like a
Hmm.
YouTube streaming program, each weekday with Australian Digital Holdings. I had a bit of a dig around, looked into it, and I found that essentially it looks like the company is new, a startup last month, and appears to be run by people who have, links to his known associates. So it appears to be just like a new media company that's spun up around Alan Jones. What do you think of his move, and now that he's done with News Corp?
I mean, as a person who used to write a column for a newspaper here in Australia, and then the column was discontinued, so I had to set up a Patreon to continue writing the column, to continue to get an audience, and it's much smaller than the audience I used to have, but I also have a level of independence now. I think he's ripping me off. I think Alan Jones is quite blatantly copying from the Sami Shah
Uh
playbook.
huh. Uh huh.
And one of the things he's going to discover very, very quickly is the amount of people who watch you on YouTube and Facebook, not as much as the amount of people who watch you on Sky News,
Mm.
is going to be a very niche audience of a lot of weird people. And yeah, it's look, I might be wrong. He could be the Alex Jones of Australia finally, which has always been
Mm.
his kind of his destiny. But
Another A Jones.
yeah, exactly. But I think the back end stuff needed to make this work, I don't think he has an idea of what all is required, because just the announcement itself was quite terribly done.
Yeah, it was shithouse. It
No,
was
no, mince your words.
yeah, no, no, yeah, no. The production quality was awful, and I mean, producing these shows now is pretty accessible, more accessible than ever before. I mean, you do see people with not a whole lot of tech, with
Hmm.
pretty available consumer tech, being able to produce high quality shows. This podcast I don't think is too shabby, and
Hmm.
it's not a huge amount of tech behind it. But we didn't see that with his announcement. I don't know how it's actually going to look when he does his show from wherever he's doing it. I just want to, pat myself on the back because this is what I've been saying for a while. When you have
Yeah.
nowhere else to go, you go straight to the people. Don't have to worry about advertisers. You can monetize, as you said, your weird audience.
Mm-hmm.
I think, he could potentially, if it does well, make a lot of money out of it. But as you kind of point out
I
as well,
see.
he does have a lot of competition now. He competes with every other weirdo out there with a camera and
Yeah.
microphone, which including us. But particularly on his end of the spectrum, I'm curious to see whether he'll indulge in his more dog whistling fringe ideas now that he doesn't have anyone essentially saying, "Hey, let's stick kind of within the mainstream kind of perspective."
Well, look, there is that whole aspect of the online, right? The more outrageous you are online, it's the same rules as television, really, but it even amped up. So the more outrageous you are, the more likely you are to build an audience and all the things. He does come with a built-in audience, but
Huge, yep.
again, one of the things you mentioned, which is money. I don't know how much of this is about money because it's not like Alan Jones is short on cash. I'm
Mm,
sure. I think in the end, this is a ego exercise, much like most media-related things tend to be, which is he's doing this because he wants to make sure that he's still out there, he's still relevant,
mm,
he's still got an audience, and he's still influential. It's no different from when Mark Latham had, I think, the Outsiders show. Before that, he had some kind
mhm.
of online show as well, and in the end, a lot of these things, it's what feeds the ego and where it goes from there. So if he finds that this isn't giving him the numbers he needs for his ego to be satiated, he'll go someplace else. But it'll be an interesting experiment to watch in the meantime.
Speaking of Jones, he was a notable absence at News Corp's co-chairman Lachlan Murdoch and his wife Sarah's Christmas party on Thursday night. There were quite a few celeb
Hmm.
luminaries, including Kate Ritchie, Qantas boss Alan Joyce, one of the Atlassian founders, and of course News Corp royalty. So Paul Whitaker from Sky, Peter Stefanovic, Chris Kenny, Paul Murray, Sharry Markson, and execs Siobhan McKenna and Michael Miller were all in attendance. Sammy, what do you
Oh.
reckon? What do you reckon their chit chat is at a party like this?
How much they're loving the latest season of Hard Quiz? I don't know. Like
Oh,
what?
did they
What
catch the
ex-
latest Murdochracy?
I know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course, of course. Yeah. What exactly does? What's the chit chat? What is drinks? What's on order? What is served for dinner? There's every a- aspect of this that I could be obsessed with,
Which
and
person are we going to install as prime minister next?
yes. Or do you think this is like that episode of Succession where
Yes,
they have
spoilers.
those
Who hasn't seen it
discussions?
yet?
um.
We're talking about the episode where the Roy family, who the
Mhm.
show's about, which are loosely modelled after the Murdochs, run a Fox News like a media company, and they go to a kind of a Republican kind of like power brokers event, and they decide who they want to anoint as their preferred candidate for president. This could be exactly the same up in Bellevue Hills.
Well, it's part of the also. If you look at for example, Alan Joyce is there, right? The Qantas boss, and
Oh
Alan
yeah.
Joyce has been attacked many times by Chris Kenny, by Paul Murray. So there's that aspect there. There's people in these mixes who you think would be at each other's throats, but clearly get along fine. Either they're all very polite around Lachlan, or they genuinely all get along behind the scenes and understand that this is all kabuki, it's all theater.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing that we've seen from News Corp time and time again is that they will even give people who they notionally supportive of a bit of a whack when they do things that
Hmm.
they don't like. And I think that's
Yes.
that's them being fickle and reminding who the power or who has the power and how they use it. They're not going to be loyal to you just because of who you are a lot of the time.
Mhm.
You are to them a what you do, and if you're doing the thing that they roughly aligns with what they want, then they'll support you. If not, they're very willing to publish something kind of unflattering about you.
Yeah, absolutely. And no one better to do that than almost everyone at this dinner. So, yeah, high pressure on the chef, I guess.
And now we're joined by Dr. Denis Muller, who is a senior research fellow at the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne. He's here to talk to us about the Media Diversity Senate Inquiry report, which dropped this week. what it said, what it didn't say, and what it kind of means for the future of News Corp and the rest of the Australian media industry. Hi, Dennis. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Cam.
Great to have you here.
Thank
Can
you.
you give us some history? I've heard, a lot about media reform. It seems like there's often inquiries into it. How did we end up in a place where we are right now? And why does it seem like media diversity is always on the cards?
Well, it's always on the cards because it's so central to the functioning of a healthy democracy. If you have too much power in too few hands, particularly when information's concerned, then of course it limits the range of views and information that will be available to voters, and not just the range, but the way the information is presented. So if you just have the very few voices we have, and really effectively, we have the ABC, SBS, the 9 newspapers, and News Corporation, basically 4, which is a tiny number. It's one of the most concentrated media markets in the democratic world. And on the question of history, there have been many royal commissions going right back to the 1950s, which have they've started out attempting to look at the issues of media power, but they always shy away from it in the end, or they mostly do. They finish up. There was the Norris inquiry in Victoria in 1991. It finished up just concentrating on issues of ownership and didn't look at questions of editorial content. There was a Royal Commission back in the early 1950s, which did more or less the same thing. And then you jump forward to 2011. Now, in 2011, you might remember there was a great scandal involving the Murdoch press in London over the phone hacking by principally the News of the World and the Sun newspapers there. And there was an inquiry set up in England under Lord Justice Leveson. At the same time, here, Julia Gillard, as Prime Minister, set up a kind of a parallel inquiry, really, under the retired Judge Ray Finkelstein of the Federal Court, assisted by Professor Matthew Ricketson of Deakin University, Professor of Communications there. I worked as a consultant to that inquiry. And at the same time, there was another inquiry going on, a thing called the Convergence Review, which was really not looking just at news media, but it was looking at more the sort of technological side of media convergence. Those 2 inquiries reported in 2012. The most significant one for our purposes is the Finkelstein inquiry. And it recommended a statutory authority to act as a media regulator. It found that the existing system of media self-regulation was a failure and said there should be a statutory authority put in its place. Now, that was not picked up by the Gillard government, and since then, nothing has happened. And then finally, what happened with this inquiry was that initially, you might remember, the former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, put up a petition on the Parliament House website, which attracted more than 500,000 signatories, calling for basically a royal commission into the Murdoch organisation. Now, that didn't actually happen. What happened was that the Senate Communications and Environment Committee established a parliamentary inquiry into media regulation and media diversity more generally. That's the report that dropped on Thursday, I think it was. So that's the history. And they make the point in their report that nothing's happened in the decade since the Finkelstein inquiry and the Convergence Review reports. The only other development, looking at this history, is that when the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, brought down its report on the global platforms, Facebook, Google, and the rest of them, in 2019, I believe it was, they recommended a single regulatory framework for all media, regardless of platform. So newspapers, radio broadcasting, television broadcasting, and online, and the global platforms should all fall within the one regulatory framework. Now, whilst the government has picked up one of its recommendations concerning the way in which the big platforms have been taking news for nothing and making them pay for it, they have studiously ignored recommendation 6 in that report, which called for this single regulatory framework.
But
And
we do seem to be closing the barn door after the horse bolted a long, long time ago. In a way, if everyone has this agreement, the consensus from the majority of the population as well seems to be that media diversity is a good thing. How did we end up in a place where we have such little media diversity in the first place?
well, we have Paul Keating to thank for a lot of this trouble. He did two things. Firstly, he drew all the teeth, more or less, out of the broadcasting regulator, which was then called the Broadcasting Authority, and replaced it with an outfit called the Australian Communications and Media Authority, which was designed not to be effective and hasn't been, and no successive government has done anything about that. The other thing Paul Keating did was that he enabled Rupert Murdoch, who was then had relatively few newspapers in Australia, to purchase a company called the Herald and Weekly Times, which owned the Herald Sun in Melbourne, the Hobart Mercury, the Brisbane Courier Mail, the Adelaide Advertiser, and the Northern Territory News. He enabled Murdoch to buy all of those titles in one go, and as a consequence, Murdoch now basically has a newspaper monopoly in Brisbane, Adelaide, and Hobart. And of course, he has the very high selling tabloids, the Daily Telegraph in Sydney and the Herald Sun in Melbourne. So it was an attempt, and Keating's on the record of saying this, it was an attempt by Keating to punish Fairfax. The Fairfax company, of course, in those days owned the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age and the Fin Review and others. And Keating regarded Fairfax as old money, irredeemably anti-Labor. And so he said, all right, well, we will allow, the Labor government of he and Bob Hawke, we will allow Murdoch to purchase all of these titles because Murdoch represents new money. And one of the most disastrous assumptions in media history, he assumed that new money meant pro-Labor. Well, that turned out well, didn't it? So
Wow,
that's how we got here.
What a history. Yeah, there you go. Jumping back to now, Dennis, did you follow much of the inquiry as it was happening? Were there any moments that jumped out to you in the hearings or out of any of the submissions that you thought were really, important that were aired?
Yes, I followed it fairly closely. I gave evidence myself. I think that the very important evidence really came from Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, here you have two former prime ministers, one from either side of politics, telling their stories, their first-hand accounts of how the Murdoch media in particular had wielded intimidatory power over both of their governments, and how, in fact, the facts prove this, that whilst they were in office, they felt unable to do anything about it. It's only since they've left office that they have felt emboldened to come out and tell us what was really going on. I think that the fact that they were two former prime ministers, two men of great intelligence and experience, giving such forthright, straight from the shoulder evidence about real world effects of the Murdoch operation in Australia, I think was extremely influential, very telling, and I think has provided a very important foundation stone for the report's recommendations.
So, what do you then think of the report itself? You seem like you quite on board with all of its recommendations, or are there any areas you think it's fallen short in?
No, I don't think it's fallen short at all. I think people will make the assumption that because it's only got two recommendations, which I'll talk about in a minute, and because it was conducted by a Senate inquiry, that it will just gather dust on the shelves. That might turn out to be true, but I don't think in the long run that it will. I think the significance of this report is, firstly, that it pulls together all the malign effects of News Corporation on the Australian democracy. Its intimidation of governments, its bullying of anyone who criticises it, its editorial lockstep at the diktat of Rupert Murdoch, which we saw, didn't we, recently with the great switch on climate change. So, all of a sudden, all of the editors of the Murdoch press all overnight decide that they'll jump in the opposite direction to the way they've been basically denying climate for the last decade. And they even had identical front pages. So this editorial lockstep, and then finally its unhealthy anti-democratic influence on our policy. This report, in fact, states at one point that that what the Murdoch press did by making this 180-degree switch on climate change was to give license to Scott Morrison to go to the Glasgow COP26 conference with a zero emissions by 2050 proposition. And it's a very telling word, isn't it? He was licensed. That is telling us something about the committee's view of the influence of the Murdoch press on our prime ministers and on our governments. So that's one significant thing. The second thing is that it lays out a policy program for media reform, quite a comprehensive policy. It talks about the importance of the public broadcasters, the very important question of making sure that Australian Associated Press is funded properly, including by government funding, because that is the lifeblood of lots of regional newspapers. Australian Associated Press is a newswire service which just reports things dead straight and provides the great bulk of copy to a lot of regional papers that otherwise wouldn't be able to cover what was going on outside their own neighbourhood. So public broadcasting, Australian Associated Press, and then it recommends a judicial inquiry to basically design a proper regulatory framework to replace the hopeless one that we have at the moment, consisting of the Australian Communications and Media Authority and the Australian Press Council. So I think that its significance lies in the sort of the broad brush, big picture recommendations that it has produced. And even though we're not going to see any action on this, certainly not before the election. I mean, politicians aren't that stupid. But somewhere down the track, I think this provides us with a blueprint for media reform of a kind that we have not seen in Australia, but which is now becoming urgent.
Can I push back on this idea of the judicial inquiry, which I haven't explained to the podcast listeners, but the difference between the parliamentary inquiry and the judicial inquiry is that it's independent. There's a judge who oversees it. A judicial inquiry could, encompass a royal commission, but that's not the only kind of inquiry. The reason I'm pushing back is because we saw immediately after the report came out, the report was essentially co-signed by Labor and Greens members of the committee. The government's member, Andrew Bragg, came out and said this is ridiculous. And then shortly after that, Labor's communication or shadow communication spokesman, or spokeswoman, I should say, came out and said, we're also not doing that even if we're elected. So what we're left with is this major, call for an inquiry that is, at least for the time being, assuming that nothing changes, assuming that people stick to their word, is a political dead end. We've also got this other recommendation, which you mentioned goes into and kind of sketches out. Don't you think that it's, I'll say that I was left feeling a little bit cold with that as the kind of main thrust of the report, knowing that there's no chance that it was going to happen anytime soon. Do you think that was a wise way for them to make this document?
Yes, I do. I don't see there was anything else that they could have done if they were going to be serious about it. I think the thing about a judicial inquiry is that it has power to require people to turn up and give evidence and to produce documents. Now, that's a very effective power because it means that corporations can't simply sit on documents that they have but are unprepared to present to an inquiry because that puts them in contempt of the inquiry. So a properly designed judicial inquiry looking, I think, specifically at the question of a regulatory framework is essential. I mean, we've had no progress since Finkelstein. I didn't agree, as a matter of fact, with Finkelstein's idea of a statutory authority. I much prefer the idea put forward by the ACCC and by Lord Leveson in England, what is called statute-based self-regulation, which means the media will will run and pay for the regulatory system, but they will do so under an act of parliament which dictates how they will do it. So I think statute-based self-regulation, as designed by Lord Leveson and proposed by the ACCC, is the way to go. But I think the effect of a judicial inquiry would be to have a strong evidence base for how that might work. Now, you're quite right to say that the Labor Party, Michelle Rowland, their communications spokesman, said, we're not doing this, it's not our policy. Well, of course she would say that. I mean, they're trying to win government. Do you think that any politician in their right minds leading up to an election is going to say to Australia's media, we are going to establish a fair income regulatory framework for you people, whether you like it or not? I mean, that's death at the box office, isn't it? I mean, let's get real about this sort of thing. So, look, I wouldn't be too concerned about the short term. The long term is what I'm looking at, and it has to be long term, because if any government's going to do this, it's going to have to, firstly, well designed, and secondly, it's going to have to be done in the first 6 months of their term of office. Otherwise, it'll be too close to the next election.
So do we now have the situation where, depending on the outcome of the next election, we might end up with more media diversity, but, if Labour wins, we win. If Labour loses, Australia loses in the media diversity game?
Yeah, I think that's pretty right, Sammy. I'm not so sure that the government, an incoming Labor government, would regard this as a high priority. I would think it more likely it might be for the first 6 months of its second term, if it gets one. There's too much else going on. I mean, there's the whole recovery from the pandemic. There's the whole question of continuing inadequacies with hotel quarantine and with the vaccine rollout. There's too much else important to people for them to be attending to this, I think, in this first term. If they got a second term, then I would be very disappointed if a Labor government did not do something about this very early on in its second term.
Dennis, were there any other media reforms that you would like to see that weren't canvassed in this report?
No. I mean, in a perfect world, you would reverse the Keating policies that allowed Murdoch to obtain those newspapers, but that requires a law that forces a corporation to divest itself of its assets. And I mean, whilst that would be a kind of a dream outcome, realistically, in a capitalist democracy, you can't do it. So you have to tailor your expectations and your desires to what conforms with bigger democratic principles. So no, I didn't. There was nothing, in my view, nothing missing from this report, and I wouldn't write it off just on the basis of the fact that it's only got 2 recommendations and discusses these issues in general terms. I think it's a sleeper. I hope it provides the basis for a media reform program going forward, but we're not likely to see it yield any fruit in the short term.
We've been focusing so much on the report and your analysis of the report and everything. One of the things we haven't really asked you, and I'd love to hear, is what do you think personally about Newscorp?
I think they are a clear and present danger to the Australian democracy. And I say that for this reason. Firstly, they make no pretense at all at impartiality, even in their news pages. So their news pages are a melange of news reportage and commentary. And in fact, in their internal code of conduct document, they say that stories can be reported in a way that leaves the reader in no doubt as to what the paper's opinion on these things should be. That is a complete abrogation of the fundamental responsibilities of a media organisation to provide the electorate with a reliable bedrock of information on which to base their choices, not just at elections, but their choices about participation in the economy or involvement in social life generally. So the fact that they provide a skewed and biased and unreliable news service in the guise of a news service is a fraud on the Australian democracy. And at a time when disinformation and misinformation is creating immense confusion in the community, that is a serious abandonment of their journalistic responsibilities, and therefore it's an abandonment of their function as what we call the fourth estate of our democracy, the estate that we call, well, what we call the fourth estate being basically the media. So for that reason, in my view, it weakens the Australian democracy.
Dennis, thank you for being a calming presence about my alarm about this report, because, I mean, as you heard, I kind of saw it as being straight away ruled out. It's good to know that, there is something beyond the short-term kind of news cycle where that will have hopefully a lasting legacy, hopefully shaping Australia's media landscape for the better. So, Dennis, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Cam.
Thank you so much, Dennis.
Thank you, Sami.
That was Dr. Denis Muller, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Advancing Journalism with the University of Melbourne.
Thank you all for listening. If you haven't already subscribed by now, what are you doing? But if you need any help to find us, we're at Murdocracy on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or just about anywhere. And we also have a podcast Facebook group where we post stuff throughout the week. It's fun. It's Murdocracy Podcast on Facebook. So check it out.
Yeah, and of course you can also support us on our Patreon, which is patreon.com/Murdocracy. And Cam and my social medias are active as well, as we're always commenting on this stuff and keeping an eye out for any of the news stories. If you find something you think we should be talking about, let us know.
We
Thank
love
you so
to
much.
hear from you. Yeah. Thanks to Natalie Sekalovska, our producer, Kevin McLeod for theme music, the ABC for the recordings from the archive, Ruby Innes for our artwork, and as always, thanks to you, Sami.
Thank you, Cam.